Hello there, good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of A Feather of Light podcast. This afternoon, I would like to talk about self-care. And self-care, in the broader sense, can be any ways that we dedicate time to taking care of our emotional wellness, our physical wellness, our mental wellness, or our spiritual wellness. And I feel it's helpful to categorize these as little subcategories because I would say oftentimes when I'm working with clients, someone comes in and they're doing a really good job taking care of themselves in one category. So for instance, maybe they're taking really good care of their body and they have a really good workout routine and their nutritional intake is really balanced and consistent, but they have no connection to spirituality or no real desire to work with emotions, which I would categorize as more of kind of like where mental wellness meets emotional wellness. I'd say those are connected. But so recognizing that each of us likely has one of these categories that we lean into and we dedicate most of our self-care towards. And it's very likely that there's one of these categories to which just over time we've gradually began to neglect. And it can be helpful to just map out what our self-care routine looks like. So this was a very helpful exercise that I did while I was in counseling school in one of the more difficult units. So it was basically a unit that's dedicated to trauma and exploring all the different types of really intense forms of, I guess, trauma, or how people experienced something that led to them essentially feeling traumatized. And there was very little that was left to the imagination, so to speak. We were going very explicitly into topics like sexual violence and, rape and pedophilia and murder and just exploring them a little bit. But to give some context, the teacher, who's actually one of the founders of the school, she works with inmates in correctional settings and has done so for a very long time. So when she speaks to these topics, we're not tiptoeing around the delicate, really triggering subjects. We're getting right into it. We're speaking very candidly and very openly about the nature of humanity and what we call the sort of darker sides of humanity. But it's also normalizing the conversation because, as mental health providers, we need to have some degree of familiarity with what can show up for a client and not, in a sense, having something trigger us so deeply that we're not able to show up with presence for a person in front of us, regardless of what that might be. Now, that being said, we also can have a certain, I would say, niche, or there's certain things that are within our scope of practice and other things that are outside of it. So we don't have to necessarily work with every single person, but there, I would say, needs to be a general familiarity with all these different topics. So getting back to why I brought this in is self-care was needed, especially in this topic. So we actually had an assignment where we were told, all right, basically write to me in a paragraph, what's your plan? What's your self-care plan? What's the constellation of different ways to which you take care of yourself on a harder day, on a consistent basis? What's your kind of like surface level routine that you typically revolve through? And what do you turn to on these days where shit's just hitting the fan and you don't know if you can make it through that day? And what's your emotional support network look like, or what's your personal support network look like on those days? And just some examples of my self-care, which I think does fit into each of these categories of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual, right? I'd say I have a balanced distribution within each of these categories, but changes each day. My needs change each day, but I'd say it's a range of yoga, meditation. The way I eat is very particular and very specific and very disciplined. And my caffeine ingestion is very closely monitored. Variety of supplements that I use. Even just doing these podcasts is somewhat therapeutic too, right? Like, I'd say the activities that I do throughout the day typically do fall into one of these categories of nurturing my physical, emotional, spiritual, or mental wellness. Sometimes I have little tools that I look to. So I have a neat little tool on my phone that's basically just walks me through the CBT process. So I reflect on a thought and kind of really unpack it and really explore it and get curious around the emotional experience of it. I do a lot of breath work throughout the day. Periodically, I try to do a couple of these breaths that are called the 4-7-8 breath. That's taught by Andrew Weil, Weil. And it's a beautiful technique that allows you to regulate the nervous system. It essentially tries to activate a parasympathetic response in the body, and it takes no time at all. You do 3 rounds of this breath. I could even just teach it to you right now, but I'd recommend if you want a more elaborate description of it or explanation of it, look it up on YouTube. Just search up Andrew Weil, Weil, 4-7-8 breath. But basically, you're just learning how to incorporate techniques that can regulate your nervous system, and then just getting in the habit of applying them a couple times throughout the day or once in a while when you need them. And this is, I would say, so much of what counselors do with clients, and I do myself especially, is teach the clients how to apply these tools and just get them familiar with these practices so that when they're in a situation where they're feeling dysregulated, it's natural. It's like, intuitive. They start breathing in a certain way, or they naturally feel called to create space or go for a walk. And I would say mapping out your self-care plan is helpful because you're able to really actively refer back to this template that you have. It's clear what your go-tos are, but then at the same time, maybe you can recognize, oh, I don't actually think I have anything that speaks to this or meets this need for spiritual connectedness or spiritual balance, if that's something that you feel you need. And I also just want to say that spiritual needs aren't always necessarily about religion or prayer in the conventional way. I would say that even the most atheist, non-pious person would still have these types of spiritual needs, which you can really just outsource in taking time for yourself to just breathe and connect to who you are and the experience of being human. Not having it be about the mind or about the emotions or about the physicality of being human, but just the experience and getting curious around the experience of being human. And maybe just taking time in nature to kind of feel into this quietness, to feel into this non-human energy, the spaciousness and I'd say there's a kind of ethereal aspect to it, or ethereal aspect to it, where you're just in an empty void, right? There's a void of human connection, and there's something about that isn't about connecting to a God consciousness necessarily, but you're just taking the time to feel into what is in this human experience when you're in the quietness. And I mean, you can be a quote unquote spiritual person without having spiritual beliefs as well. I do very strongly believe this. You can go and be of service to your fellow man just because it feels like the right thing to do, just because you maybe appreciate the good feelings of fulfillment, or maybe you ask the big questions in a very pragmatic, scientific way. You're seeking answers, and you're going down a bit of, I'd say, a spiritual rabbit hole or inquiry. But it's not about beliefs that pertain to a religion, or maybe there's a lack of a pursuit for some kind of God consciousness. You're just curious. And I would say sometimes you can even just look to the everyday struggles of a person and what they're able to overcome and endure, and really like connecting yourself with the human experience of suffering, connecting yourself with the realities of the nature of being human. This can also be, I'd say, a very profound ability to tap into a form of spirituality, just witnessing the human experience, connecting to the human experience. And it's not necessarily about interpretation or understanding what the spiritual meaning is, but I would say there's an experiential version of spiritual meaning, or experiential process of engaging with spirit you don't even have to name it. You don't even have to be consciously aware of it. And this is what I'd like to propose, spiritual wellness. It's not always about oming and meditating and doing yoga, whereas I believe those things are important for me and my balance of self-care. I would say that there's a variety of different ways you can attain a form of spiritual fulfillment without it being explicitly about a spiritual practice. Now, emotional wellness, I feel, is a little bit more clear and a little bit more, I would say you're probably more aware if you're working with your emotions. And that can look like having people in your life that are able to receive you in your emotional experience, right? Having a strong emotional support network. Who are your go-tos? Do you surround yourself with people who have the capacity to support you emotionally? Do you have maybe an individual person whom is your kind of rock and in a sense is your primary emotional support, but are they somebody who really has that capacity in a sustainable way? So for example, I like to bring up this topic on my Instagram reels, how your romantic partner should not be quote unquote your therapist. And here's why. Because it's not a sustainable outlet, and on some capacity, you're thrusting them into a position or a role that they might not be able to fully handle. Are they aware that they're basically taking on the role of therapist at times, and other times they've shifted into a more vulnerable state where they need the emotional support? And so it gets complicated is what I'm trying to say. It forms what's called a dual relationship, where they take on multiple roles, they put on multiple hats. And for sake of simplicity, I would say most people should have a primary emotional support, and then they should have a series of secondary emotional supports, or maybe they shift from one to another primary supports, so that you're not just fully relying on and depending on one person to meet that need fully. And I would say even a therapist, just one professional, regardless of their credentials and their capacity, isn't necessarily enough for you to, I'd say, successfully traverse the complex nature of the emotional experience and what, the demands, so to speak, of navigating so many different emotions and so many different tribulations and challenges. So who's your team? What's your team look like? How capable is your team of holding you up when you really need it? Is there a need for a boundary if there's somebody who maybe doesn't really receive you fully? And can you have the awareness to recognize when that is the case, and then to set boundaries around that and seek somewhere where you can find that emotional support? Or conversely, on the other side of that, is there somebody who takes a lot, who really needs a lot of space? And are you capable of setting that boundary so that they're not taking all your energy, or not, I guess, crossing that boundary, that threshold? Because you can support people in your life. I really think you will. If you have functioning relationships, you're going to be emotional support, whether you choose to or not. There's going to be a certain point, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there might reach points where, actually very likely you'll reach points where someone might just need a little bit more space than you're capable of giving. And I would say having a healthy emotional wellness really does look like setting the boundaries at those times, or having those conversations with people who are, let's just say, leaning into you for a lot of emotional support. And what that looks like in terms of setting the boundaries, or I guess how that functions, is a twofold. It goes both ways. So when you set a boundary with a person in your life, whether it's in a relationship, whether it's a family member, or maybe it's a professional relationship, you're making an agreement that each person has the right to set a boundary and have that boundary honored. So you're creating a dynamic where each individual is allowed to set boundaries and say no when they need to say no. And that can be honored and that can be respected. So having a healthy support network can look like saying no, so that you're able to fully receive a person. Essentially, your yes becomes more predominant as well. So linking this back to emotional wellness, it's just really about having a strong, effective support team who are your allies, who really can, support you when you need it the most. But at the same time, you're not giving away your energy unnecessarily. You're not allowing others to have access to you at times where maybe you just really need to take some space, to take some time for yourself. And when I speak to self-care, it's not always about, dedicating a day to yourself to rest and slow down, or the things that you normally would associate with being self-care. I really just want to emphasize that sometimes self-care is just going out and doing the thing that fulfills you, dedicating space to just going for a walk, or going to the social thing that maybe you've been feeling kind of somewhat on the fence about. It's like doing the things that make you happy, feeling like connected to other humans, or taking, I want to say, risks in a way to go out and experience life. And so there's like this balance of self-care looking like being social and going out and kind of exercising your inner extrovert, quote unquote. But then there's so much of self-care that does look like just spending time to write, to reflect, to journal, to sit in stillness and do absolutely nothing. So it's like both ends of the spectrum, introversion, extroversion, pendulating between those two. Which one do you sort of gravitate towards? Are you an introvert? Are you an extrovert? Are you a sort of, balance of both in some way? There's a continuum, right? I'm something like I suppose it's not definitive, but I've been defined as something like a 70-30 split. And I would argue that means that I think my 70 is introvert and then 30 is the extrovert. So I need to push myself to go out and do things and experience community events. And once I'm out there, I have a phenomenal time. But I require so much more space to just recharge. Now, don't take this as fact, but I've heard this through the interweb, through the Instagram grapevine, that the human design format or template. So I'm a what's it called? A manifesting generator. Apparently, I need a lot more time to recharge my creative juices. I can't just go out there and just boom, 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 boom. Be this creative, I guess, sporadic, explosive, like source of human energy. For me, it's really about creating incredible expressions of, I guess, like meaningful creative explorations or projects, and then spending so much time just recharging, tending to my needs, being in my own space, really just allowing myself to water myself, to water my garden, to nurture my mind, my relationship to my body, not to push myself too hard. And in a society where we're just kind of like, go, 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 be productive, do all the things, look like you can handle it all and do it all and be it all, I have to fight extra hard to just be okay with taking time to do nothing, really taking care of myself and choosing myself over seeing another person. I was thinking about this the other day. I was talking to my twin brother, and he's like, I'm going to go to Wreck Beach. And I'm like, wow, damn, that sounds cool, but that sounds like a lot. I'm actually feeling more called to dedicate my time to just going to a lake and going for a hike and just being out in the mountains and listening to the river and being away from people as much as humanly possible. And that's where I'm at. I actually wanted to spend time with him. I wanted to go and hang out with him, but I was like, yeah, where you're going actually doesn't feel aligned with where I'm at or what I need right now. I'm more looking just for like exercise, connection with nature and the land, and praying to that land, and some alone time to just think and feel and just be in my body. And from my experience, going to a public place where there's a lot of people, a lot of potential for connection, a lot of noise, it just pulls me away from that experience. And for me, it's meeting multiple areas of this, this wellness sort of category or categorization that I've mapped out. There's a spiritual need there being met. There's a physical need there being met. On some level, maybe there's some emotional needs that are being met. And maybe mentally, but I would say less so. That wasn't really about working with my mind. And can I also really just honor that in terms of self-care and taking care of ourselves, there's definitely seasons, right? Seasons of the mind, seasons in general, right? You look to summer, spring, fall, winter, and how winter is typically where you do the inward reflections. You become more introvert. If you follow the seasons, that's what you can do. Summer is about getting out there and being creative and expending life force and connecting with other humans and getting all that great vitamin D and, adventuring and exploring. And I would say that that's what feels natural for us as humans. But if you're trying to create a consistent balance within all these different areas, it might be harder to meet certain needs in certain seasons than other specific needs that are, let's just say, more aligned with the environment that's created through that season. So I guess that's just the first piece of it. If you want to go out and explore the world out in winter, it might be a little bit harder, might be a little bit colder, might be less people socializing. Or if you feel like you want to really deeply go into your internal experience and process emotions, and it's the summertime and everyone's out and doing stuff, there might be more external pressure to go out and, enjoy the sunshine, and people are inviting you to do things and you have to say no. But I would say this is also part of the process of really having strong self-care is recognizing that your internal seasons are also valid. Like, as much as the seasons that are out there, the changing of the weather and the temperature and the amount of people that are out enjoying themselves is something you have to consider for sure. But your internal seasons are also deeply valid and need to be acknowledged. Because if your seasons are changing within you, they're cycling, they're shifting, they're changing what your needs are. And that influences or impacts your yeses or your nos in terms of, what's in alignment with your needs. This is something I would say many women probably have a lot more experience with, for the most part, because of the cycles that they go through with their menstrual cycles, right? Their capacity to be attuned to these cycles and adapting to the shifts and just the overall awareness and attunement to their bodies. Now, as men, we also have ways to which we can attend to the cycling of our energy, right? If you've ever done semen retention, you're able to really bring awareness to how much men's hormones fluctuate as well. And they do so in different ways. And there is certainly, like, men go through hormonal spikes and shifts in relation to testosterone, how much they're working out, just all these different things, right? But maybe as a man, you aren't trained in the same way for as long, at least, or as consistently as women are, to really attune to these cycles and listen to these internal cycles and prioritize them, right? If you're prioritizing your internal cycles, maybe it's easier to meet your emotional needs or your physical needs because you know what happens when you don't. There's a kind of consequence. It's clear to you why you want to prioritize your internal cycles and not just go with the ebb and flow of the seasons and the shifts of the external cycles. So I've got a bit off the topic of, the map I've put out for self-care, but I really felt the need to go into this topic when talking about emotional wellness, because emotional wellness looks like noticing your internal shifts and your internal cycles, what your needs are, how you're honoring yourself emotionally, and what your attunement is like to your body, which is, I would say, also relating to physical wellness. Now let's just scratch the surface of mental wellness, because I feel like I've talked to each other wellness except for mental wellness, which is a very challenging one. For myself, at least, because what does it look like to be quote unquote mentally well? It's like, do we have this idea of mental wellness that I would say on some level doesn't actually encapsulate the process of being balanced within one's mind? Like, I would say so much of our definition of what it means to be mentally well is associated with some sort of clinical perspective, or capitalism. It's actually usually tied to capitalism in terms of your level of productivity or your capacity to really show up in your relationships and have this sort of perception that you're doing well, you're rocking it in your life, right? You're the peak performance, and that translates to you being mentally well. I would argue that does not encapsulate what it means to be mentally well, whereas those can be indicators of a person who has achieved balance within their life. I would say oftentimes a person can appear very mentally well off externally, but their internal process is a fucking mess. And there's just so much going on under the surface that just isn't being addressed, or it's kind of like something of a facade. So, I guess if I were to attempt to define how I view mental wellness, I think it does relate to how you speak to yourself, what your internal dialogue is like, what is your capacity to hold space for yourself, I think would be the best way to define it. What is your capacity to hold space for yourself? you know, recognize and accept and have grace for your thought process. That's a tough one. How does one really quantify what contributes to a person being mentally well without it being some kind of criteria, right? Like some kind of diagnostic thing. That feels so off to me. But at the same time, maybe there are external indicators, right? Maybe there are tools that do contribute to a person having balance within their relationship to their mind. This is a bit of a subjective definition, but I'd almost say that mental wellness can be the result of really attuning to and having balance within the other three. If you have a really strong emotional wellness score, quote unquote, and you're taking care of your body, so your physical wellness is well calibrated, and your spiritual wellness is being met in some way, you're fulfilling that need somehow, I would say your mental wellness might be a reflection of the other three, fueling this type of centeredness or this type of balance within the mind and the expression of your mind. And speaking of expression and how the mind kind of contributes to one's ability to express themselves, I would say a perfect example of this that I can speak to, at least, is how being ADHD or neurodivergence versus being more neurotypical really does change the perception of what mental wellness even looks like. So, I mean, you can't really nail down a definition of mental wellness when so much of our internal workings might not directly translate to how we express ourselves externally. And I would say we just have to be open to understanding that so many different people have different ways of thinking and different ways of expressing themselves and different ways of, I would say, embodying mental wellness, that we almost just have to have a criteria that really includes all the different types of ways people express themselves. And you can't just try to fit somebody into a definition of mental wellness that's really just designed for sake of clinical diagnosis. It's not actually encompassing a person having a sort of equilibrium within their mind and their body and their spirit and their relationships to their emotions. So I think this is most of what I wanted to cover today. This topic can go into a lot of different tangents and philosophical sort of explorations, but I just wanted to speak to the practical stuff. So, if you haven't already, maybe just take some time to write down, what is your self-care plan? What does your self-care routine look like on a week by week basis? What are some ways that you could improve your self-care? What are some things that you might be able to try out? How do each of these activities fit into these 4 categories of physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional wellness? Are you more introvert versus extrovert? And how does that translate to your ability to take care of yourself and how you might create the self-care plan? And of course, what are your internal cycles? How long do they last? What do they even, what's an indicator of some sort of internal cycle shifting? And how does that relate to the seasonal shifts that we all collectively experience? So I just invite you to get curious on that when you're starting to map out your self-care plan. Maybe picking up some tools, right? I've recommended breath work as one, but there's a variety of different tools that you can learn. I would say going to a coaching or counseling session can really give you the space to spend time to actively explore what works for you. And oftentimes a mental health professional will have a lot of resources and they'll have a lot of different tools they can bring in that you can experience directly. Or if you don't feel like doing that, go to a yoga class, try it out, see how it feels. Go for a walk if you have some free time and see how it feels in the body and what insights come up, or what happens when you turn off the mind, what just kind of comes up for you, and how can you just be in that experience. And what's your support network look like? What is your emotional support network? What's your team look like? Who are the people that you go to? Are they capable of holding space? And lastly, what's your relationship to the word no? How often do you feel like you're able to comfortably and safely express your no's? And even just in relation to going out and experiencing the world, your yeses, so that your emotional wellness, your internal world feels safe and intact. And when you're going out and experiencing things, you know you're where you want to be. And I guess that's just it, is self-care is being where you want to be and knowing that you can do the things that are more challenging because you can trust yourself to put yourself in a place where you want to be. And you're basically just holding space for yourself, really. You're holding space for yourself in every way possible. So thanks for tuning in today. Again, if you are feeling called to work with me one-on-one, I do have availability. Reach out. We can do a call. I can do a free 15-20 minute call just to explore some options. But aside from that, take care of yourself. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.